What's up guys, Ibra here with HardwareCanucks and welcome back to another video. AMD's Ryzen Threadripper is finally here. In fact, I've had this for about a week now and I can finally get to share all the results with you guys. I can also tell you that if you're a professional or someone who's just looking to get a lot of work processed in a short amount of time, you'd want to hang out for the duration of this video because there's a lot to discuss and even more to test. Today I'll be taking a look at two processors from the Threadripper family, so the top of the line 1950X and its baby brother the 1920X, and we'll be comparing it to Intel's offerings including the Core i9-7900X and a ton of other processors. Now we could just jump into the benchmarks and call it a day, but I wanted to discuss a few more things including Threadripper's architecture, new memory modes, installation procedures, but most importantly about X399 chipset. So let's dive in right after this.
What?
Is that the View 31? You should put a ring on it.
Yes, time to make it RGB official. Thermaltake Riing high static pressure fans, because your case deserves a ring. Full details in the description below.
Okay, just to refresh your memory on the specs of these new CPUs, let's kick things off with the 1950X. Priced at $1,000, you're getting 16 cores and 32 threads operating at a base clock of 3.4 GHz and a 4-core boost speed of up to 4 GHz or higher to 4.2 GHz with AMD's extended frequency range, aka XFR. Its baby brother, the 1920X, is set to retail at $800. That features 12 cores and 24 threads operating at a slightly higher base clock speed of 3.5 GHz versus 3.4 on the 1950X. Meanwhile, the 4-core boost speed remains the same. So here comes the comparison part. Intel's current grand offering is the Core i9-7900X. It's a 10-core, 20-threaded processor operating at a base clock of 3.3 GHz with a turbo boost up to 4.3. On paper, the 1950X should crush the CPU in synthetic benchmarks and real-world use case scenarios, but that's not concerning. What I am looking for is how well the $800 1920X would compete with the $1,000 7900X. To be clear, this CPU has 12 physical cores and 24 threads, so that's 2 extra cores than the Intel, and the base clock is 300 MHz higher on the 1920X, yet it costs less. But as we all know, clocks and threads aren't as important as the architecture itself, and luckily Zen has proven to be very good. AMD also decided not to restrict their chip's interconnect bandwidth, so every one of these Threadripper processors gets access to 64 PCI Gen 3 lanes. Compare and contrast with Intel's 28-lane i9-7800 and the i7-7820X, along with the 44-lane 7900X, and you can see why AMD believes lane allocation could allow them to win big. One area of concern is the TDPs of these processors at 180 watts. Threadripper is a massive chip with a ton of cores, so power consumption and heat output are very high. That will be something to take into account when choosing a power supply and cooler. Stepping things down a bit, we have the 1900X priced at $550. This is an excellent entry point into AMD's X399 platform because if you're looking to configure a system to take advantage of all 64 PCI lanes without having to break the bank for the much expensive 1950X, this is it. It's also a direct slap on the face for Intel's $600 i7-7820X 8-core 16-threaded CPU that only supports up to 28 PCI lanes. The 1900X is only launching at the end of the month and we'll have a full review then. Another important thing to mention is that AMD's specifications on clock speeds are just guidelines and every chip could behave differently. During my testing, I made sure to log frequencies on both processors, and while the 1920X hits all the targets, the 1950X had lagged behind in the all-core boost and XFR rate departments. Not only that, but I found AMD's biggest chip hit those speeds less often, which could cause the 1920X to win out in some lightly threaded scenarios. More on this later. If you recall my Threadripper Explained video, I mentioned how all TR4 CPUs support quad-channel DDR4 memory, but its limitations with speed bins remain identical to those on Ryzen 7, 5, and 3. That means optimal compatibility remains at 2400 MHz, whereas 2666 and 3200 MHz are considered overclock frequencies. Perhaps this should turn into an excellent investigation video. Also guys, Threadripper is all about the unpacking experience as well. This is actually the retail package these processors will ship in. Open it up like this, twist the handle, and the processor comes right out. It's a great looking system that will catch your eye in store. Let's talk a little bit about the new TR4 socket. First up, it's of course massive, and I mean really massive, and the new socket takes installing a CPU to a different level. Now out of the box, there are two tools that are required to successfully install the processor. Let's start with the torque style screwdriver. It comes with an automatic stop function to ensure you don't over tighten the CPU retention plate. It's also used to loosen the three screws which hold down the socket bracket to prepare the area of reception for a CPU. Next up is an adapter bracket for most Asetek source liquid coolers. I'd recommend you head over to AMD's microsite to check out which coolers are compatible. Needless to say, Threadripper's thermal output and its IHS size make most current air and AIO coolers incompatible, but this bracket quickly fixes that problem, but only for liquid coolers. Air-based heatsinks from Noctua and others are on their way. Installing the CPU is fairly simple but very interesting. First, the CPU slides into the TR4 retention bracket and then clicks into place. Then you'd have to lower the processor within its retention brackets and push down until they click into place. The final step is to simply reuse the supplied torque screwdriver to tighten down the main retention plate by following the simple to understand 1, 2, 3 order engraved on the bracket. While we're on the topic of sockets, let's discuss X399 and what it brings to the table, but I'll use the Asus ROG Zenith Extreme for this since I actually have it here. At $550, that's right, $550, this will be one of the most expensive X399 boards on the market, but there is a good reason for that. It features an immense eATX form factor and it's geared towards overclockers who are looking to push the already power-hungry Threadripper processors. First of all Threadripper CPU's 64 PCI Gen 3 lanes AMD advertises are broken down into 60 usable by the processor, while the other 4 are dedicated for communication to the X399 chipset. In Asus's case, the 60 lanes are broken down into 2 X16 slots and 2 X8 slots for graphics, along with 3 X4 Gen 3 groupings for SATA or PCI storage. The lowest PCI slot actually shares bandwidth with the included U.2 connector, so when a drive is installed, the slot will only run at X4 speeds. In order to actually fit all of these storage devices, Asus did something pretty cool. There's a single M.2 slot fed by 4 lanes below the chipset cooler, and there's also this, which is called a DIMM.2 card. It plugs into the slot right next to the memory modules, and it can have 2 additional M.2 drives installed, each of which have access to 4 dedicated PCI lanes. That's pretty cool. I should also mention that Threadripper doesn't officially support hardware RAID over the M.2 interfaces, so you will be stuck with software RAID solutions for these high-speed connectors. Besides that, the rest of the connectors are pretty straightforward since they originate from the X399 chipset that we talked about a little earlier. There's 6 SATA 6 gigabits per second ports, an Intel LAN controller running from a PCI Gen 2 connection, and 4 USB 3.1 Gen 2 connections, including a front panel header and a Type-C port on the backplate. Asus even found a new PCI lane to include the mother of all wireless solutions with a single Wi-Fi AC module and 2x2 MU-MIMO wireless AC plus Bluetooth 4.1 chip. Enthusiasts are just gonna love this. Now before I get into the benchmarks, I need to explain the memory modes for Threadripper. They can be set from within the BIOS or AMD's Ryzen Master utility. There's the distributed mode, which is a default setting and local. After switching between each, the system will need to reboot, so it isn't exactly a smooth process. The distributed setting maximizes bandwidth and should benefit applications that put a priority on large memory footprints. Good example of this are rendering programs and video conversion applications. The local setting reduces overall bandwidth, but it also lowers latency. According to AMD, many gamers prefer lower latencies and could get higher frame rates in the local setting. The reason why AMD is doing this is Threadripper's architecture includes a pair of separate processing nodes, which can cause memory access times to increase due to a number of factors. I'll be testing the effects of this switch a bit later, so stay tuned for that. Okay, so now for the benchmarks, and I'll start with the usual system setup page. So IDA64 is our first stop, and it offers a quick glance at Threadripper's strengths and weaknesses. The first benchmark actually highlights an interesting result since the 1920X is actually quite a bit better than the 1950X. No, this is not a misprint. After running the test several times, I realized that this is a very lightly threaded test, and the 1920X was actually achieving a consistently higher clock speed by about 175 MHz than the 1950X. As for the other benchmarks, they are pretty straightforward and reflect the relative strengths of the Ryzen architecture. It rules in multi-thread workloads but blows the competition out of the water when it comes to AES acceleration. In our synthetic benchmarks, we see there being a bit of a positive and negative for Threadripper. In Cinebench Multicore, the 1950X and 1920X outclass the i9-7900X in a big way, but when dealing with mixed workloads of PC Mark, the situation changes quite quickly with both being middle of the pack performers. Then W Prime comes around and the Threadripper processors are right back on top with amazing results. Moving on to the single core performance in both Cinebench and W Prime shows that despite having pretty high clock speeds, the Threadripper processors are a bit lacking in single threaded workloads. But they aren't that bad either, as both come with 10% of the i9-7900X. That's actually a pretty good result, but let's get some real world testing before passing any judgments. Starting off with 7-zip, and the 1950X's huge number of cores and threads obviously pull a lot of weight, but the i9-7900X isn't that far behind. The 1920X also has an excellent result. Adobe Premiere Pro shows about the same thing, but I was quite surprised there wasn't any more separation between the much more core-heavy AMD processors and the i9-7900X. Well, it turns out that throwing more cores at Adobe produces a diminishing rate of return, as it can't effectively utilize more than 18 concurrent threads, whereupon it starts relying heavily on core clocks and architecture optimizations. That's why the 1950X still beats Intel's flagship, but only by a small margin. If your job involves rendering complicated scenes or HDR images, Threadripper is definitely the best way to go from a price to performance perspective. Both Blender and Corona show that more threads can be used in an efficient and time-saving manner. With GIMP and many other photo manipulation programs preferring higher clock speeds over multiple cores, it was obvious the Threadripper processors would suffer. Our custom photo manipulation test actually saw the 1950X and the 1920X come right up against the Ryzen 5 1600X rather than the faster Intel processors. Luckily, Handbrake saved the day by allowing Threadripper to flex some incredible muscles and beat down Intel's highest-end desktop processor. The hits continue with another rendering program, POV Ray, and Threadripper showing that it may be the best choice out there for professionals. Unfortunately, WinRAR takes some wind out of AMD's sails, since the 1920X and 1950X barely match Ryzen 7 processors. This is likely due to memory latencies in the default distributed mode. The initial synthetic gaming results in 3D Mark looked pretty promising, with the Ryzen Threadripper processors remaining near the top of the charts in the DX12 benchmarks. Unfortunately, the Firestrike benchmark brings things crashing back down to the earth, with neither processor being able to match Intel's higher-end chips. Now, when it comes to gaming, the results don't really fare any better with the 1950X and the 1920X, as they struggle to compete with the 1600X in Battlefield 1. However, this also goes to show that none of the HEDT processors do particularly well, since the i9-7900X is just a few frames ahead. Like we keep saying, buying a 16-thread or higher processor exclusively for gaming is just a waste of money. Even Call of Duty Infinite Warfare backs that up with some low results for Threadripper, but as usual, it's not too far back from the i9-7900X. Deus Ex shows pretty much the same results as the last two games. Basically, the Threadripper chips are just as fast as the Ryzen 5 1600X, and within 7% of the i9-7900X. Meanwhile, Doom's performance is capped by the game engine, so all of the processors perform identical given the fact that we're running these games with a Titan XP. Finally, we start to see some separation in GTA, but once again, the real stars of the show are the lower-priced 4 to 8 core models from AMD and Intel. Those little CPUs are just amazing values for gaming. Threadripper keeps it close to the i9 though, which is great news. Finally, Overwatch is just more of the same, as it doesn't care if you have a $200 processor or the one that costs $1,000 to deliver the best performance. Closer to the beginning of this video, I mentioned that AMD implemented two different memory modes in an effort to give users the opportunity to fine-tune their systems based on different usage scenarios. On one hand, distributed mode prioritizes raw bandwidth, while local mode is supposed to lower latencies by retaining memory transactions close to a controller-associated core. In addition, the Asus Zenith Extreme has something called auto mode, which isn't really automatic at all. It simply utilizes the system default, which is distributed mode. So let's see how they fared. The IDA memory benchmarks show exactly what AMD claimed. Higher memory read bandwidth for distributed mode and much lower latency when NUMA is activated. Somewhat ironically, write bandwidth isn't touched at all. As we can see, the memory subsystem setting has very little to no respectable impact upon synthetic testing. This actually surprised me since I was expecting an application like Cinebench to take advantage of the additional bandwidth being offered, but that didn't happen. It could be very well that the 2666 MHz memory speeds I have set on these tests is somehow influencing differentiations. In longer real-world benchmarks, the memory mode obviously has the effect, at least in the two applications I tested. Corona sees the advantage fall to distributed mode, while After Effects, a notorious memory hog, obviously sees some benefits with higher bandwidth. Just like distributed mode shows net positive reactions in real-world multi-thread scenarios, games obviously see benefits from the local mode. The uplift isn't all that much, but the results were repeatable, so there's definitely something behind AMD's madness. The question I have to pose is pretty simple. Is all of this flicking of switches, reboots, and other detractors from an otherwise fluid platform experience really worth a 2 to 3% uplift in frame rates? Granted, there will be outliers that benefit even more from a NUMA setup, but I personally don't think the fuzz is worth a while. I do, however, have to applaud AMD for opening up this feature. I just wish it was integrated through application detection rather than direct user interaction. But what about power consumption? Well, that's going to be interesting too. Let's check it out. Naturally, these results really do require a bit of context. Even though Threadripper is built on an efficient manufacturing process, the sheer number of cores housed within each CPU package guarantees these will be among the most power-hungry processors ever created. And yet, both the 1920X and 1950X consume less power than AMD's now ancient FX 9590. When compared against Intel's i9-7900X, both processors may actually have a slight performance per watt lead in some highly multi-threaded applications. Remember that the 1920X boasts 4 more threads than Intel's current HDD flagship and yet consumes about the same amount of power. As for temperatures, that's always a tricky thing to comparatively measure on processors, and doing so with Threadripper is even more difficult. The problem is that none of my air coolers that I used on other processors fit onto its mammoth IHS. Hence, I was forced to use an NZXT X42 and hope for the best. It worked, but the temperature results weren't anything to be proud of. With the fan spinning at auto mode, both processors idled between 29.6 degrees Celsius and 31.1 degrees Celsius. Hitting the 1950X with a multi-core load saw temperatures spike to 80°, while the 1920X ended up hitting just about south of that at 78.5°. You need to be serious about cooling these processors, guys. So now that I've gone through everything else, I think it's about time to get into some overclocking. I wasn't expecting much, but the 1950X and 1920X actually delivered some respectable results, but I had to change out that single bay AIO for one of the triple fans. The NZXT X42 simply couldn't keep up with the temperatures produced by these processors. Installing that resulted in complete stability for both the 1950X, finally leveling off to 4 GHz, while the mighty 1920X kept going all the way up to 4.14 GHz. The problem with both ended up being the epic amount of voltage needed to get to those points. Supposedly, there's a new BIOS revision in the pipeline that will lower voltage thresholds for overclocking, and I'm already anxious to try that. Another thing that you'll need to watch out for is power consumption. Due to the voltage increase, the 1950X ended up sucking down 348 watts for the whole system in comparison to the stock 260 watts. The same could be said for the 1920X, which went from 242 watts to 333. Like I said, be prepared. Alright guys, so this review video is turning out to be one of the longest we produced for HardwareCanucks, so I think it's about time to wrap this up. So, what do we think of AMD's Ryzen Threadripper? Well, it ultimately depends on what you want AMD's high-end desktop system to do. For example, if you're someone whose work requires processing multiple workloads, like say you're doing parallel processing tasks, including virtual machines, or even content creation while also streaming, if you're a researcher, software developer, then X399 might be a really good option to look into. When all of its cores are working away at the same time, the Threadripper 1950X has the capability to beat the best Intel has to offer, to do so while also not costing a penny more than the i9-7900X. But I actually think that the $200 less expensive 1920X is the real star of the show, since it can match the i9-7900X in many applications and offer 90% of the 1950X's performance. In some lightly threaded benchmarks, it was actually able to pull ahead of the 1950X since it operated at consistently higher clock speeds. The potential issues with buying Threadripper or any other high-end desktop system lies within two factors: gaming and applications that don't necessarily support massive thread counts. If you're strictly gaming and if you're not using programs that require higher core counts, then investing in Threadripper or even Intel's Core X series might be overkill. In fact, adding more cores hurts gaming performance more than it helps. However, if you foresee ever needing the Threadripper to prosumer uses alongside gaming, I'd recommend the 1920X over the i9-7900X any time of the day. The 1950X is a bit harder to justify though. I think for the current HEDT market, Threadripper is exactly what we needed. While it may not bring down the cost of entry into the HEDT space, AMD has managed to perfectly balance price, performance, and even power consumption in a CPU series that matches or beats some of the best Intel has to offer. Honestly guys, Threadripper is something amazing that's about to finally bring some real change to the PC market. Great job, AMD. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on AMD's Ryzen Threadripper CPUs, namely the 1950X and the 1920X. Which of the two CPUs would you pick and why? Also, what do you guys think of its performance compared to Intel? I'm Ibor with HardwareCanucks. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe for more similar content. We have a ton of coverage coming very soon. But yeah, I guess we'll see you in the next one.